Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Settle in, take a slow breath, pull the blanket a little closer if you have one, because tonight we are going to do something a little different. We are not going to rush. We are not going to skim the surface of the lore and move on. Tonight we are going to sit with one of the most quietly terrifying stories in all of science fiction and fantasy. A story that has been unfolding for 60 million years before the events of the 41st millennium even begin. A story about an entire civilization that went to sleep and what happens when it starts to wake up. This is the story of the Necrons, and I want you to understand something before we go any further. When people talk about threats in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, they talk about the roiling green tide of the greenskins, the endless hunger of the hive fleets, the slow rot of chaos, just the arrogance of the Eldari. All of those things are real and terrible in their own distinct ways. But underneath every planet where civilization has taken root, underneath the cities and the farmlands, and the landing pads and the manufactorums, there are places where something ancient has been sleeping, waiting. And in the late 41st millennium, that something is beginning to stir. The Necrons are not just robots. They are not just skeletons made of metal and given weapons and pointed at an enemy. They are something far more sorrowful and far more dangerous than any simple description allows. They are a people, a living, breathing, feeling people, who made a choice 65 million years ago that they could never take back. And now, as they crawl out of the darkness of their tombs one world at a time, they carry that choice with them like a weight pressed into their necrodermis bones, encoded into every command protocol that replaced the souls they no longer have. Every creak of metal as a Necron warrior rises from its stasis crypt, every spark of cold green light igniting in hollow eye sockets that have been dark for longer than humanity has existed. Every grinding, deliberate step of a Necron phalanx across ground that was theirs, long before any other sapient life in this galaxy drew breath. All of it is the echo of that ancient, irreversible decision. The decision that a people made in grief and desperation and burning, unquenchable need. The decision that their king approved and has been trying to atone for ever since. So tonight, we are going to walk through all of it. We are going to start before the beginning, which when the Necrons were still flesh and blood and grief and disease. We are going to move through their transformation, their war, their terrible long sleep, and the slow, broken, beautiful, horrible process of their waking. We are going to meet the kings and the lunatics and the collectors and the commanders who make up this civilization. And at the end, we are going to sit with the question that the Necrons quietly ask of everything they encounter, the question that is threaded through every line of their lore, every battle they fight, every dynasty that drags itself out of the dark. What is left of you when everything that made you who you were has been taken away? Let us begin. Part 1. The silence before the storm. Imagine a planet, not a dramatic planet, not a world of fire and brimstone or shrieking void storms. Use something quieter than that. A world that was, in some distant past, perhaps quite beautiful. Continents of pale stone under a sun that has grown old and tired. Plains that stretch to the horizon without a single living thing to break the line. No grass, no insects, no birds calling from somewhere beyond sight. Not even the ordinary microscopic life that makes soil rich and dark rather than pale and sterile. Just rock and wind moving across rock, and the occasional dust that rises and settles and rises again in patterns that have nothing to do with living things, because there are no living things here to disturb them. This is a tomb world, and it has been like this for a very long time. The sterility is not accidental. It is not the result of some natural catastrophe or the slow dying of a biosphere already in decline. Yet it is the deliberate handiwork of the beings who live beneath the surface of this world, who stripped it of life with careful thoroughness before they went under, as a preventive measure against threats they understood would come with time. They needed their sleep uninterrupted. They needed nothing on the surface that could attract the wrong kind of attention or provide the wrong kind of foothold. And so they scrubbed the world clean, and then they descended. Somewhere below the cracked and sterile ground, behind layers of technology that no living civilization in the 41st millennium fully understands, something is beginning to happen. It does not announce itself. There is no thunderclap, no sudden pillar of light, no dramatic event visible from the surface. There is only the slow and careful reactivation of systems that have been dormant for so long that the stars visible from the surface at night have shifted measurably in their positions since those systems last ran at full capacity. The physics of the universe have moved on around this buried place, and the buried place, very gradually, is catching up. The first things to stir are not Necrons at all. They are the Canoptech constructs, machines built to maintain machines, engineered caretakers and guardians whose purpose never included sleeping in the first place, because the tombs require constant tending even during the deepest hibernation of their masters. These constructs have been active, in a quiet and methodical way, for every one of the 60 million years that the Necrons have been asleep. They have repaired, they have maintained. When they have made cold calculations about which systems to prioritize when power fluctuated, which stasis crypts to sacrifice to keep others running, which damaged tunnels to shore up, and which to seal and abandon. They have been doing this without complaint, without fatigue, without any of the biological limitations that would have destroyed an organic caretaker long ago, because they are not organic and do not experience time the way organic minds do. Now their work changes. The Canoptech spiders, vast arachnid constructs hovering on humming anti-grav plates, their compound visual sensors sweeping the burial chambers with mechanical patience, begin to move with a new intensity. Their fabricator claw arrays, which have spent millions of years performing slow repair cycles calibrated to minimum power usage, accelerate into something faster, is something that an observer with enough familiarity with Necron technology might recognize as urgency. Systems that have degraded beyond the baseline they were maintaining need assessment. Power conduits that have corroded below acceptable tolerances need repair or replacement. Stasis fields that have wobbled and drifted from their calibrated parameters need to be brought back within range before the beings they contain can be safely revived. All of it must be catalogued. Much of it must be addressed, and the calculations involved, the endless branching decision trees of what to repair first, what to defer, what to simply record as a loss and move on from, are exactly the kind of work the Canoptech spiders were designed to perform. As they drift through the vast subterranean halls of the tomb complex, or as they birth Canoptech scarabs in rippling, chittering waves, these small beetle-like constructs pour from compartments in the spider's carapaces like a silver tide, spreading through the chambers in their thousands, then their hundreds of thousands. Each one receives directives from the central tomb mind, the master control intelligence distributed through the very structure of the complex like a digital nervous system, maintaining what coherence it could through the long ages of hibernation. And each one responds with the purposeless-seeming busyness of insects doing exactly the work they were made for. The scarabs fan out, driving through the dark corridors on their many small legs, navigating the vast underground spaces with an ease that suggests they have memorized every inch of the tomb in the millions of years they have been patrolling it. They repair, they maintain, they clear debris from passages that have partially collapsed, they eat, in the sense that they disassemble and convert organic matter that has managed to work its way into the tomb through cracks in the rock above, removing even the microscopic traces of biology that might indicate a path of entry. They ensure that when the revival sequence begins in earnest, as many sleepers as possible will survive the transition back to what could, generously, be called wakefulness. The tomb mind watches all of it. It has been watching for 60 million years. It has calculated and recalculated, run simulations against every relevant variable it could model. It's made adjustments to the sleep schedule of specific units based on detected degradation of their stasis crypts, allocated power in ways that its original designers intended, and in ways they did not fully anticipate. It has done all of this without anything resembling emotion, without ceremony, or mourning, or the weight of knowing that what it is protecting is not simply hardware, but minds, such as minds remain. It has lost some of them. The tomb mind carries a precise accounting of every failed stasis crypt, every scattered engram cluster, every Necron that entered the sleep and will not wake from it. These are recorded as losses the way an accountant records losses. Accurately, without sentiment, in the appropriate column. There is, however, a certain kind of pragmatic awareness in a tomb mind that has been watching over the same population for 60 million years. It knows these names. It knows these designations and tactical roles, and the last recorded state of each consciousness it was charged to preserve. The losses are not nothing to the tomb mind, even if nothing in its processing can be described as grief. They are a ledger of what it was unable to protect, and the tomb mind's algorithms have, over the eons, grown somewhat better at protecting what remains. The energy the reactivation process generates is considerable, not subtle, detectable, in fact, across meaningful distances of space, humming at a frequency that no human instrument fully understands yet, but which pulses outward from below the surface of this quiet and sterile world, like the first breath drawn after a very long silence. On the surface, if anyone were there to see it, nothing appears to have changed. The plains are still empty. The sky is still the pale and heavy color of a world with no biosphere to add color or warmth to the light. The ruins of what was once architecture, towers and walls that have been crushed and rounded and ground down by 60 million years of geological patience, still jut from the earth at the horizon like old teeth in a jawbone worn down to almost nothing. But below, in the dark, something is waking up, and it is remembering what it was owed. Part 2. The Necrontyre. A people born in suffering. To understand the Necrons, you have to go back to the beginning. Was not the beginnings of the 41st millennium, not the beginning of the Imperium of man, or the Eldari civilizations, or even humanity's long climb from the mud. You have to go back 65 million years to a race of beings who looked, in many ways, quite a lot like us. Bipedal, organic, intelligent, social. A species with language and culture and history and art. A people who built cities and raised families and studied the stars with instruments whose principles we would recognize, even if the engineering details would require some learning. The Necrontyre were mortal. That is the first and most important thing to understand about them, and it is the key to everything that came after. They were flesh and blood and bone, warm-bodied and short-lived in a way that made the weight of their existence feel almost unbearable to them. It was not as philosophy, but as immediate and physical daily reality. They lived on a world near a volatile star, and that star was not kind to them. The radiation that poured down from their birth sun was not the kind of radiation you find on a world with a healthy ozone layer and a magnetic field. It was hard, penetrating, the kind that gets into cells and disrupts the mechanisms of life at their most fundamental level. It did not merely inconvenience the Necrontyre, it killed them. Slowly, relentlessly, and in ways that made every generation of them acutely aware of death, in a way that perhaps no other species in the galaxy has been since. Cancers were not the exception among the Necrontyre. They were the expectation. A long life, by their standards, was perhaps 4 or 5 decades of moderate health, followed by whatever the particular malignancy afflicting them allowed. Many lived far less. Their children, the rare and precious children of a people so radiation-scarred that fertility was itself a constant struggle against biology, did not always survive to adulthood. The treatments they developed for the conditions their environment inflicted on them were extensive and sophisticated. The Necrontyre were, by any measure, highly advanced. But sophisticated treatment is not the same as a cure, and there was no cure for living under a star that was trying to kill you. And so the Necrontyre built a civilization in the shadow of death. They built it with a desperate urgency that their short lives demanded, and with a cultural focus on death and legacy, and what might come after that shaped everything they touched. But their architecture was monumental and tomb-like, not because they were morbid for its own sake, but because they were a people who knew, in the gut, that nothing built in a lifetime would last long enough to matter unless it was built to outlast bodies and generations. Their art was obsessed with permanence. Their religious practices centered on the afterlife, on the question of where the dead went and what might be preserved of a person beyond the body. They were a people who built enormous and beautiful tombs, some of the finest pieces of architecture in the galaxy's history, because the tomb was not a monument to death. It was an act of defiance against it. They also expanded outward. I said using stasis crypts and slow-moving ships clad in the living metal they called necrodermis, a material that could resist radiation damage in ways that organic matter could not. The Necrontyr spread from their birth system to other stars. They colonized worlds. They built an empire that, by the time they came to the notice of the galaxy's older powers, stretched across a significant portion of the spiral arm they inhabited. The dynasties multiplied. The dynasties quarreled, as dynasties will. The Triarch, the ruling council of 3 pharaohs, who governed the unified Necrontyr civilization, headed by the figure known as the Silent King, spent considerable energy managing the internal tensions of a civilization in which the brevity of life had made patience a rare quality and ambition an extremely common one. Through all of this, and the star kept burning, and in the sky above their crown worlds and their colonies, on worlds whose longer lives and calmer suns must have seemed almost unbearably luxurious, there were beings who did not die. Not quickly, at any rate. Not the way the Necrontyr did. The Old Ones were ancient and immensely powerful, a species that had been shepherding and shaping life across the galaxy since a time before the Necrontyr civilization existed. Masters of the warp in ways that made them effectively immortal, or at least so long-lived that the distinction barely mattered. The Old Ones moved between the stars through their vast webway, a network of dimensional passages that let them traverse the galaxy with a speed and freedom that the Necrontyr, with their torch ships and their stasis crypts, could not match. As they shaped the very biology of worlds, they seeded life. They were, as far as any civilization that encountered them could tell, the closest thing to gods that the physical universe produced. The Necrontyr looked at the Old Ones, and they wanted what they had. The burning, resentful, consuming want of people who have always suffered and have now encountered people who have not. They asked, the stories suggest they asked with some genuine humility at first, that there were diplomatic missions and carefully worded requests through channels both political and personal, for the secret of the Old Ones' longevity, for some share in that immortality that would lift their people from the grinding misery of their radiation-shortened lives. The Old Ones said no. The law is ambiguous about the exact reasoning. We know what the Necrontyr experienced as the refusal and how they interpreted it. We do not have the Old Ones' perspective, because the Old Ones did not survive the events that followed in any form that left records. Perhaps they had reasons that would have made sense to a being of their age and perspective. Perhaps they genuinely believed that giving immortality to the Necrontyr would create a civilization too dangerous to leave unchecked. Perhaps, and this is the reading that carries the most weight for how the Necrontyr responded, they simply did not care enough about the shorter-lived species to make the effort. The casual indifference of the very powerful toward those who suffer beneath them is a familiar kind of cruelty, and it does not require malice to inflict. The Triarch saw what they needed in the refusal, and a people fractured by dynastic rivalry and internal tension, suddenly united by the absolute clarity of being told that their suffering was someone else's problem, and they could sort it out themselves. The wars of secession that had plagued Necrontyr civilization for generations were set aside in the face of a common enemy, a single source of all the injustice the Necrontyr had accumulated over the lifetimes of countless generations. The Old Ones had what the Necrontyr needed. The Old Ones had refused to share it, and the Necrontyr, who were many and increasingly technologically formidable and absolutely furious, went to war. The first wars, as they came to be known, went badly. The old ones were immensely powerful, and the Necron, for all their advancement and all their numbers, he kept losing in ways that suggested the gap between them was wider than simple military technology could bridge. Entire fleets were destroyed. Armies were routed and pushed back. The colonies the Necron had worked so hard to establish on worlds where the sky did not try to kill you were lost, one after another, until the empire that had spread so far was contracting back toward the poisoned light of its origin. The wars of secession, which had been suppressed in the fire of common purpose, began to resurface in the cold ash of defeat. The Triarch held things together through increasingly desperate measures, and then, in the darkness between stars, something answered their despair. Part 3, the C'tan and the Devil's Bargain. The C'tan, the Star Gods, was entities so ancient that describing their age requires choosing between numbers that lose all meaning above a certain scale. They came into existence at the very birth of the universe, not as evolved beings, not as the product of billions of years of biology working toward complexity, but as direct expressions of the fundamental forces that shaped the cosmos in its earliest moments. Pure electromagnetic energy given the quality of consciousness. Not intelligence in any way that organic life would recognize, but awareness, appetite, the slow accumulation of something that functioned like thought when given billions of years to develop. Before they met the Necron, the C'tan fed on stars. They drifted through the galaxy, impossibly vast and diffuse, as their presence spread across volumes of space larger than solar systems, and they drank the radiation that stellar fusion produced. Tasty in the way that the background hum of the universe is tasty to a being whose palate was formed at the moment of creation, but not particularly interesting, not varied. The C'tan had been doing this for so long that the experience of it had faded from novelty into habit, and habit, over billions of years, has a certain deadening quality even for minds that do not experience time the way we do. Then the Necron made them physical. This is one of the more remarkable moments in the galaxy's history, and it is worth pausing on. The Necron, in their search for allies, or simply in their study of stellar phenomena, detected the C'tan. What they detected was not what you would typically recognize as a life form. The C'tan, in their natural state, are not visible, not localized, not bounded by anything resembling a surface or a form. They are patterns in the electromagnetic spectrum across vast stretches of space. The Necron nevertheless found them, recognized them as entities, and, whether out of religious impulse or pragmatic calculation, decided to try to communicate. To make communication possible, and to make the C'tan into allies who could interact with the physical world in direct ways, the Necron forged bodies for them. They used their living metal, necrodermis, the same material that clad their void ships, were resistant to radiation and self-repairing, and they crafted vast physical shells designed to contain and focus intelligences that were used to existing across light years. The C'tan descended into these bodies with what the records describe as relish. The physical universe, experienced from within a body rather than drifting through it as energy, was revelatory. Every sensation was new. Every interaction with matter was novel in ways that billions of years of formless existence had not provided. Among the most interesting new discoveries, the warmth and electromagnetic complexity of biological life, the way a nervous system fired, the specific, focused, tremendously intense electromagnetic signature of a biological organism going about its life, so much richer and more complex than the diffuse radiation of a star. The C'tan discovered, what in their new physical forms, a hunger they had never known before, not for stellar radiation, which was plentiful and satisfying in the old way, but for something more focused, more intimate, more alive. The Deceiver came to Sarek first. Mephetran, known as the Deceiver, the C'tan who had earned that title because, among the C'tan, He was the one who understood organic psychology well enough to lie to it. He presented himself as a potential ally in the Necrontyre's war against the Old Ones. He said his kind had also suffered at the Old Ones' hands, which may or may not have been true. He spoke of shared enemies and mutual benefit. He spoke of power sufficient to turn the tide of the wars. And then he made the offer. He called it immortality. He called it the solution to everything the Necrontyre had ever suffered. Their flesh, which the radiation of their birth star had turned against them, would be shed. The mortal body, with all its limitations and vulnerabilities, and the miserable brevity it imposed, would be replaced by something permanent. Metal, the living metal that had already proven its resilience across the vast distances of space. A body that would not age, a body that would not die from radiation, a body that would repair itself when damaged, a body that would, in every practical sense, last forever. The Necrontyre would have their immortality. What Sarek did not know, what the deceiver carefully and precisely did not tell him, was what the process would cost, what the price of that immortality would be. What, specifically, would be consumed in the biofoundries when the Necrontyre walked in. Sarek deliberated. Whilst the historical records are fragmentary here, but we know the broad shape of the debate. Some of the Triarch's advisors urge caution. Orican the Diviner, the court astromancer who would survive the Great Sleep to become one of the most important figures among the Necrons of the late 41st millennium, specifically counseled against the pact. Whether his warnings were of the spiritual or the practical kind, or both, the law does not confirm. What we know is that the argument was intense and long. We know, too, that not all the dynasties went willingly once the decision was made. The Kansu dynasty fought with armed revolt, their nobles choosing combat over the furnaces, and had to be dragged into biotransference by force. As the history of the Necron Lord Raxan tells us that he was actually one of the few Kansu nobles who chose the process voluntarily, who believed the holdouts were foolish, who helped bring his own people to heel, and who spent the rest of his immortal existence trying to atone for that choice, pursuing the capture and imprisonment of every surviving Citan shard, as a form of penance that can never be fully completed. But Sarek said yes. The Triarch approved the pact. The biofoundries were constructed, vast structures whose inner workings are not preserved in any surviving record, because the only records of their operation were written by beings who entered them as flesh and came out as something else. And those beings' subsequent cognitive state was not conducive to careful documentation. Into the furnaces marched the Necrontyre, or dynasty by dynasty, world by world, city by city, family by family, person by person, into the cyclopean grinding heat and light of the conversion chambers, and out the other side as something that wore the shape of the Necrontyre, but was not, in any way that the universe recognized as meaningful, the same. Metal where there had been skin, engineered composites and living alloys where there had been bone, a chassis of necrodermis humming with borrowed function, housing a consciousness that had been stripped out of one vessel and poured into another, and not all of it had made the journey. The quality that makes a mind alive, not the information, not the memories, or the tactical knowledge, or the learned behaviors, but the animating spark of it, the thing that made it feel rather than simply process, that had gone elsewhere, upward, as in the electromagnetic detritus of the conversion, consumed by the true forms of the Citan, swooping above the biofoundries in a kind of ecstatic feeding frenzy. They ate the souls of a species, the entire psychic content of a civilization 65 million years old, the emotional and spiritual substance of an entire people's history and love and grief and hope, poured upward out of the conversion chambers and was consumed by star gods who were doing exactly what they had always intended to do. Sarek was among the last through the process. He emerged on the other side, looked at his metal hands, looked at the faces of his people, the green glow of eyes that had replaced the warm irises he remembered, the absolute stillness of expressions where there had been expression, to the grinding quiet of a species whose voices had been mechanical and whose movements were now deliberate in the way that machines are deliberate. And he understood. The Necrontyr were gone. Something else had come out of the furnaces in their shape. Something immortal, yes. Something capable of vast power and physical endurance beyond anything they had possessed in flesh. But the Necrontyr had been defined, above all else, by their grief, by the intensity of their feeling about the injustice of short and painful lives. The Necrons, the things that wore their shapes and carried fragments of their memories, were a people with no souls remaining to grieve anything at all. Zarek experienced this not as emotion, those were largely gone, but as something cold and absolute and precise, a knowledge with no warmth in it. All the Citan had taken the harvest they had always intended to take. The biotransference had not been a gift, it had been a feast. And his people, his beloved and suffering people, had walked willingly into the jaws of it because he had told them to. He had failed them utterly. Part 4, the war in heaven, there was still a war to fight, and the Necrons fought it. This is important to understand because the war in heaven is not simply a backstory. It is the event around which all of Warhammer 40,000 lore ultimately orbits. The war in heaven is the wound in the galaxy's history that everything else grew from. The Ice Eldari exist because of it. The Orcs exist because of it. The state of the warp, the nature of the Chaos Gods, the very structure of the universe's spiritual dimension, all of it traces its origins back to this ancient, apocalyptic conflict that raged for longer than humanity has existed as a species. The Necrons, now metal and soulless and vast in number, joined their Citan masters in the renewed war against the Old Ones with a terrible and implacable efficiency that the Necrontyr, in their mortal form, had never been able to achieve. Where the flesh and blood Necrontyr had struggled against the Old Ones and lost, the Necron legions advanced with a relentlessness that organic armies could not match. They did not tire. They did not panic. They did not break under fire or falter when their numbers were depleted, because they could be repaired and reconstituted and sent forward again, armed with Gauss weapons that strip matter apart at the molecular level, layer by layer. Mounted in ships driven by inertialist drives that required no conventional propulsion and could traverse the galaxy with breathtaking speed, they pushed the Old Ones back from system after system. The Citan led the advance. These beings, now fully embodied and feeding on the souls and energies of the living things they destroyed, were forces of nature in the most literal sense. Entities of such scale and power that entire fleets redirected simply from the electromagnetic emanations of their presence. They extinguished suns as tactical moves. They consumed solar systems. They moved through the Old Ones' webway using the dolmen gates the Necrons had constructed, vast portals of living stone that forced entry into the dimensional network the Old Ones had built for themselves, and struck at the enemy through their own highways. Except the Old Ones were losing, and in their desperation, they did what powerful beings in desperate circumstances so often do. They escalated in ways that created problems they could not have fully predicted. The Old Ones began seeding worlds with new life at an accelerated pace, not the careful, patient ecological engineering they had practiced across billions of years of gentle shepherding. This was urgent creation, species designed specifically for war, engineered to possess stronger connections to the warp than any life the Old Ones had created before. The warp was anathema to the Citan, who were creatures of pure material existence, beings for whom the immaterial realm was as hostile an environment as vacuum is to organic life. If the Old Ones could create species that wielded the warp as a weapon, they could fight back. And so the Eldari were born, or at least accelerated in their development, a species of extraordinary psychic sensitivity, whose connection to the immaterial was so profound that they could weave it into weapons and tools and ways of moving through reality that no purely material civilization could match. And the Krork, the thunderous and violent predecessors of what would become the Orcs, massive, aggressive, biologically engineered to fight and keep fighting, carrying within them a connection to the warp that expressed itself as the collective unconscious force that would one day make their very belief in the efficacy of their equipment a self-fulfilling physics. And other species, some of whose names survive in fragments, others lost entirely. This worked, for a time. But the psychic power of these new races pushed the Necrons and the C'tan back. The tide of the war turned. The old ones created armies, threw themselves against the metal legions with an intensity that the purely material forces of the Necrons struggled to counter. For the C'tan, who could not draw power from the warp and could be wounded by forces that operated through it, these new foes represented a genuine threat. But the warp is not a precision instrument. The psychic energies of billions of beings experiencing war, the terror and grief and rage and despair of countless species, fighting and dying across thousands of worlds for generations, poured into the immaterial realm and began to change it. The warp had always been turbulent, a reflection of the emotional states of the living things that gave it its substance. But it had been manageable turbulence, navigable by the old ones who understood it. Now it began to churn with something new. Emotion amplified to cosmic scale. Feeling given form and purpose and hunger, beginning to coalesce around the most intense concentrations of psychic resonance in the conflict. The first stirrings of what would one day become the Chaos Gods were planted in the soil of the war in heaven. Not yet the distinct and terrible entities of the 41st Millennium. That full birth would require the catastrophic fall of the Eldari millions of years later. But the seeds were there, growing in the emotional sediment of an apocalyptic war that showed no signs of ending. And then came the enslavers, predatory warp entities, things that had always existed in the immaterial realm, as drawn to the psychic richness that war had created in the warp. They began emerging into real space through the minds of the psychically gifted species the old ones had created, infecting them, taking over their bodies and using them as gateways to pull more enslavers through. The infection spread with the indiscriminate efficiency of an epidemic through populations that had been prepared by generations of psychic development to be particularly vulnerable. The old ones' carefully engineered weapons turned against their makers, the Eldari, the Krork, the other young races. Many of them fell to the enslavers or to the warp corruption that spread with them. The old ones were broken, the coherence of their civilization fractured, their webway was disrupted and sections of it fell to the enslaver infection. Just the ancient masters of the galaxy, the beings who had been its shepherds and architects for longer than most species had existed, were scattered and defeated. The Eldari survived, would eventually rise to fill the vacuum left by their creators. But the old ones themselves were gone. The galaxy's greatest power, the civilization that had shaped species and worlds, and the fundamental order of life across the stars, simply ceased to be. The Necrons, too, were exhausted. Entire dynasties had been lost in the fighting. The attrition of 65 million years of conflict had ground through the Necron legions in ways that the biotransference's promise of immortality had not fully covered. Revivification systems strained under the demand. Battle damage accumulated faster than repair could clear it, and the C'tan was satisfied and glutted on the consumption of so many lives across so much conflict, were beginning to look at their Necron servants with the same evaluating hunger they had once directed at the biofoundries. Zarek had been watching all of this. He had been thinking, coldly, precisely, with the kind of calculation that the removal of most human emotion makes possible when it does not make it impossible. About what he knew, what the C'tan were, what would happen if he allowed things to continue. The Necrons had won the war in heaven, but they had won it as the C'tan's weapons, and weapons that have served their purpose tend not to be stored carefully. He had prepared. The revolt of the Necrons against the C'tan is one of the most staggering events in the setting's history, and it is partially obscure in the lore because Sarek afterward deliberately removed the detailed memory of the weapons used from his people's minds. The weapons were too powerful, too dangerous, to allow the knowledge of them to persist and be potentially misused. What we know is the outcome. The C'tan were broken, not killed. The C'tan could not be killed, being part of the fundamental material fabric of the universe, but shattered. Each Citan was sundered into thousands of smaller fragments.
I want to pause here for a second and just say something honestly. I started researching this topic thinking it would be a straightforward lore breakdown, and then I got to the point about the Necron warriors, how they still carry that tiny flicker of self-awareness, just enough to know something is wrong but not enough to do anything about it, and I had to step away from my notes for a minute. That hit differently than I expected it to, because it's not scary in the way a chaos demon is scary. It's sad in a way that feels almost too real for a tabletop setting. Like someone sat down and decided to write one of the most quietly devastating things they could think of, wrapped in skeleton robots, and called it a wargame. That's the thing about 40k. You think you're here for the battles and the cool armies, and then the lore sneaks up on you. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
Shards, each one containing the personality of the whole, but stripped of its godlike scale of power. Into containment vessels they went, imprisoned by the very race they had enslaved. Some remain that way, some have escaped or been used as weapons by the dynasties that hold them. As the Citan shards moved through the galaxy as dangerous echoes of what they were, furious at what was done to them, the war was over. The galaxy lay broken and changed forever, and Sarek looked at the wreckage of his civilization, at the depleted and damaged dynasties, at the legions of mostly mindless Necron warriors who carried the shapes of people in metal that no longer remembered being people, and he made one more decision, perhaps the most important one of all. Part 5. The Great Sleep. The galaxy was not ready for the Necrons. Not yet. The Eldari were rising, young, vital, psychically extraordinary. They were filling the void left by their creator's defeat, with a civilization of remarkable scope and ambition. They knew the Necrons. They had fought beside the old ones against them. They feared them in the deep, a specific way that comes from understanding exactly what an enemy is capable of. And they were at the height of their power in the wake of the war. The Necrons, exhausted and depleted, could not fight them, not to victory. There was also the problem of the enslavers. Those warp entities that had helped destroy the old ones were still spreading, still finding hosts in any sufficiently psychic species, still using the living as doorways to pull more of themselves through from the immaterial realm. Any world with minds connected strongly enough to the warp was vulnerable. The chaos they were creating made consolidating any kind of coherent Necron empire essentially impossible. Zarek had a plan. It was the kind of plan that only a being who has already made the most terrible decision imaginable could make, because it required the same cold, a ruthless calculation that had led him to approve the biotransference in the first place. He had done something monstrous once in the name of protecting his people. He was about to do something almost as extreme and far more deliberate. He ordered the tomb worlds built. The great Necrontire cities were transformed over the course of what must have been decades of enormous engineering effort. The surface infrastructure, the spires and domes and transit systems and marketplaces that had made Necrontire civilization visible on the worlds it inhabited, was dismantled or buried. In their place, descending into the rock and the mantle of each world, vast subterranean complexes were constructed, which honeycomb chambers of stasis crypts, lined with the equipment needed to preserve a Necron consciousness at the lowest possible level of activity for spans of time no biological life could meaningfully imagine. Tomb mines, the distributed intelligences that would coordinate the management of each complex, were installed, tested, calibrated, and given their instructions. Canoptic constructs were programmed with the maintenance routines they would execute continuously for the duration of the sleep. The Necrons scrubbed the surfaces of their tomb worlds clean. This is one of the quieter horrors of Necron lore, the deliberate elimination of every living thing on every world that would become a tomb, down to the level of bacteria and microbes in the soil, was to ensure that nothing biological could provide a foothold for enslaver infection or attract the attention of the Eldari. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a calculation. The worlds needed to be sterile. The worlds needed to be quiet. The worlds needed to look like dead planets, not like the sleeping hearts of the galaxy's greatest civilization. And then, in a sequence that we do not have the precise chronology for, but which must have unfolded over considerable time, the dynasties descended, one by one, dynasty by dynasty, world by world. The Necrons went into the dark, the pharaohs and overlords and their courts, the cryptechs and the immortals and the Lich Guard, the warriors and their support units, all of them surrendering to the stasis crypts. The mechanical slowdown of every process in their bodies and their minds, to the point where time, for them, effectively ceased. The canoptech constructs remained awake. They have always remained awake. They are awake right now, on every active tomb world across the galaxy, doing their work in the dark. Zarek's final command, encoded into the engrammatic pathways of every Necron mind before the last of them went under, was simple in its expression and enormous in its implication. Sleep for 60 million years, then wake, rebuild, restore the dynasties to their former glory, reclaim what was lost. He destroyed the command protocols then, the engrammatic tools that had given him direct control over the minds of his subjects. The same tools the C'tan had insisted on embedding in the biotransference process to ensure that the Necron race would always, ultimately, obey its king. He severed the chains he had used to rule. He gave back what little free will remained. Then, without looking back, and I want you to sit with that phrase for a moment, because there is something deeply human in the decision to not look back. The knowledge that if you turn around you will not be able to keep going. Zarek boarded his flagship, the Song of Oblivion, and sailed out of the Milky Way galaxy entirely, into the void between galactic structures, into the darkness where even stars are only distant lights rather than present realities. He left his people to their long sleep. He left the galaxy to whatever would happen next, and he went to find, and in the emptiness between the structures of the universe, whatever measure of solace or penance the last of the silent kings could find. Below the purged and silent surfaces of thousands of worlds, the stasis crypts hummed with cold, steady purpose. The canoptech spiders drifted through empty halls. The canoptech scarabs skittered over the faces of sleeping Necrons, tending and repairing. The tomb minds watched and calculated. Time passed. 60 million years of it. The galaxy changed around those silent worlds in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the Necrontyre who went under. Stars were born and died. The enslavers eventually ran out of hosts and their plague faded, leaving the galaxy quiet and recovering. The Eldari rose to heights of civilization so great they seemed to contain the whole future of the galaxy within them. Humanity pulled itself out of primordial mud, through stone tools and fire, and sailed across oceans and split the atom and reached the stars and built an empire that stretched across 1,000,000 worlds. The Eldari fell in an apocalypse of their own making that birthed a new god from their collective souls. The Age of Strife tore human civilization apart, and the Emperor rose from the ashes and sent his sons to reunite the scattered stars. And below it all, the metal dead slept on. Part 6. What wakes in the dark? The revivification process and its failures, nothing that complex, maintained for that long, goes perfectly. The Necrons were extraordinarily capable engineers, the most technically advanced civilization the galaxy has ever produced, and certainly the most ancient in the 41st millennium. But 60 million years is a span of time that has a way of finding the weaknesses in any system. The universe is patient and thorough in its erosion, and even the finest technology the Necrontyre ever built was not entirely immune to 60 million years of slow, methodical entropy. Many tomb worlds did not survive to the awakening. Some were destroyed by the simple, indifferent physics of the universe. Stars that went supernova in the interim consumed their orbiting planets without any awareness of or interest in what might have been sleeping beneath the surface. Tectonically unstable worlds crushed their own buried cities as the slow movement of geological plates amplified over millions of years You transformed mountains and valleys in ways that no surface survey 65 million years ago could have fully predicted. Some tomb worlds were found, by the Eldari primarily, who made a deliberate practice of destroying Necron sites whenever they located them, and either damaged beyond recovery or entirely eliminated. Others fell to the simple entropy of time, cascade failures in stasis systems, spreading through interconnected power grids in the slow chain reaction way that small failures sometimes have when they find other small failures to connect to, destroyed entire populations of sleepers without any external cause at all. The casualties of the Great Sleep were enormous. No final accounting exists, but the conservative estimates in Necron lore suggest that billions, possibly far more than billions, of Necrons who went under did not wake up. Dynasties that had been powerful forces in the war in heaven emerged with fractions of their former numbers. A few did not emerge at all, their entire tomb complexes lost to catastrophes that left no survivors and no records. For those that did survive the 60 million year wait, the waking was rarely smooth. The intended process was methodical. Each tomb world had a central control intelligence, the tomb mind, that coordinated reactivation according to a predetermined algorithm. The canoptek constructs moved through the tomb first, assessing every system, repairing what was repairable, flagging what was not. But then the Necron warriors were brought online in carefully sequenced waves, their revivification simpler because their minds had been simplified during biotransference, less complex and therefore less vulnerable to the kinds of cognitive degradation that time inflicts on more intricate consciousness. The warriors ran diagnostics, began patrol sequences, fed information back to the tomb mind. Then, based on what the warriors found, the tomb mind made decisions. Were there threats on the surface that needed to be eliminated before the Overlord was awakened? Were the power systems stable enough for higher function revivification? Was there anything in the broader environment suggesting a disruption to the revival sequence? Only when the algorithm said conditions were appropriate did the process continue upward through the hierarchy, the Immortals, the Lichguard, and eventually the Overlord who governed the tomb. In theory, in practice, the errors introduced by 60 million years of imperfect preservation were numerous and varied. The most common failure mode was gradual cognitive degradation. The engrammatic pathways that housed a Necron's consciousness, already simplified by the biotransference compared to the biological brains the Necrontyr had possessed, were fragile things across spans of time that long. The most frequent result was a consciousness that came back online in fragments rather than coherently, scattered and incomplete, requiring years or decades of gradual self-repair before something resembling the original personality could be reconstructed. In some cases, the reconstruction was successful. In others, partial recovery left a Necron permanently diminished, functional, capable, but missing pieces of whatever they had been before. And in some cases, recovery never occurred at all. The lore uses the term severed worlds for the most complete failures. Tomb worlds, where every consciousness in the complex suffered total engrammatic dissolution during the hibernation, leaving metal bodies that function but carry nothing inside them. On these worlds, the canoptek constructs still patrol their maintenance routes. The warriors still march in their patrol patterns, still respond to proximity sensors, still engage anything that registers as a threat. But the minds that should be directing them, the personalities that should be shaping the behavior of these machines into something coherent and purposeful, are simply absent. The bodies run on cached instructions. They perform the last functions they were assigned before the sleep, forever, without variation or adjustment, because there is nothing inside them capable of adjustment. Other Necrons refer to these places with something that functions like horror. The sight of what they could have been, what many of them almost were, is not something that the Necron mind, however diminished, can easily dismiss. Some tomb worlds did not wait for their chronostats to reach the intended threshold. External disturbances triggered defensive activations. A survey team from a young civilization drilling too close to the surface, Us a mining operation accidentally breaching a corridor wall, a seismic event opening a crack through which the traces of the outside world could intrude. These early activations were not revival sequences. They were alarm responses, the canoptek constructs, and whatever warriors were already functional reacting to perceived threats, while the deeper sleepers remained undisturbed. Sometimes the alarm was addressed and the tomb went back to waiting. Sometimes the disturbance was severe enough that the sequential revivification was disrupted entirely, with cascading effects that no algorithm had been designed to handle. And sometimes a Necron Lord woke alone, long before any of the sequence was supposed to begin, because of a stasis crypt malfunction that affected only their specific chamber. Emin spent decades in empty corridors before the solitude did to their psyche what 60 million years could not quite manage. There are records, incomplete, filtered through second-hand accounts and Necron testimony that is not entirely reliable, of overlords who awakened to find themselves the only functional consciousness in their entire complex, surrounded by the quiescent bodies of their subjects who could not yet be safely revived, and who spent years alone in the dark before anything else woke up. What that experience does to a mind that is already working without the full complement of emotional architecture that biological psychology would provide is difficult to specify precisely. Well, what we know is that some of these overlords emerged from that solitude with their tactical function entirely intact, and their grip on anything resembling sanity somewhat more tenuous than it had been. Part 7. The Dynasties Rise. Kingdoms from the dark in the late 41st millennium, as the Imperium of man staggers under the weight of its endless wars, and the Great Rift tears the galaxy in half. The Necrons are waking. Not all of them, not simultaneously, but enough that across dozens of worlds, in enough systems that the word pattern begins to apply, something ancient and implacable is beginning to move. Each dynasty rises in its own way. Each bears the mark of its own history, the particular character of its pharaoh, the specific disasters and survivals of its 60 million year sleep, is the accidents of which tomb worlds came through intact and which did not. The differences between the dynasties are not cosmetic. They reflect 65 million years of a civilization that was already fractious before it went under, now emerging into a galaxy that has changed beyond recognition, each one working out its relationship to that new galaxy according to its own lights. The Sautek dynasty, when the law wants to identify the most powerful, the most aggressive, the most expansionist of the currently active Necron dynasties, it points here without hesitation. The Sautek are the dominant force in Necron politics at the dawn of the era Indomitus, controlling 80 tomb worlds and growing. Their ruler is the being who sees that dominance with an efficiency that should serve as a lesson to anyone who wakes up from a long sleep and finds the house in disarray, is Imhotep the Stormlord. Imhotep's ascension is a story that tells you everything about how Necron politics actually works after the Great Sleep. When Mandragora, the Sautek crown world, awakened, the pharaoh who had ruled it before the sleep had perished during the hibernation. His stasis crypt had failed at some unknown point in the 60 million years of darkness, and by the time the revivification sequence began, there was nothing left of him to revive. The lesser nobles who awakened first looked at the vacant throne and did what nobles throughout history have done when a throne is vacant and no obvious succession mechanism is in place. They fought over it. They did not wake their superiors, because each of them feared that any superior would immediately become a competitor rather than a patron. So Mandragora spent the better part of a decade in low-grade civil war, its recovered tomb complex becoming an arena for political ambitions that most of the contestants would not survive. Resources were wasted. Progress on revivification was halted. The nascent Sautek dynasty tore at itself with a focused energy that would have been impressive if directed outward rather than inward. One of the smarter pretenders eventually identified a solution. He could not win the civil war through force. The balance of power was too even. But he could recruit an ally. So he reached into the deeper stasis crypts and woke Imhotep. Abhishek Sheesh Amatik the Stormlord, a Nemesaur, a battlefield commander of such legendary reputation that his campaigns had been studied and debated by Necron tacticians across the dynasties for as long as tactical discourse had existed among their people. The pretender who woke him imagined he was bringing in an ally powerful enough to tip the balance in his favor. He had catastrophically misunderstood what Imhotep was. Imhotep looked at the civil war surrounding his awakening and felt what, in a being with more of a soul, might have been described as a fence so deep it bypassed anger entirely and arrived directly at action. This was chaos, disorder, an offense against every principle of efficiency and purpose. He raised his own forces with a speed and precision that none of the contenders had anticipated. He systematically eliminated all 6 of his supposed allies and rivals, declared himself Pharaon, and began the conquest of the galaxy approximately 1 decade after waking up from a 60 million year sleep. His strategic genius is the genuine article. Imhotep does not fight battles. He fights campaigns within campaigns, and his operations span entire sectors simultaneously in ways that make it genuinely difficult for his enemies to determine which assault is the main thrust, and which are designed to bleed their resources and attention. He uses terror deliberately and scientifically, having studied the psychology of organic species with the cool detachment of an observer whose existence is not threatened by anything they might do in return, and arrived at precise conclusions about how to break the will of defenders before the shooting starts. His one consistent tendency that opponents might try to exploit, he never kills his defeated enemies in personal combat, choosing instead to wound them severely and leave them alive to carry the humiliation, is perhaps less a weakness than a long-term statement of supremacy. Imhotep does not merely want to win, he wants his opponents to carry the fact of having lost him for the rest of their existence. He severed the hand of High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars and left him alive. He taunted Helbrecht with perfect calm before the battle, noting that 10,000 years of imperial rule had produced remarkably little in the way of results. These are not accidents of character, but they are the deliberate communications of a being who has decided that the psychological dimensions of warfare are as important as the physical ones. His great frustration, the opponent his system of logical prediction consistently fails against, is the Orcs. Imhotep is a master of logical probability. His campaigns are built on the precise modelling of how rational opponents respond to given conditions. The Orcs are not rational in any sense his models can accommodate, and their battlefield behaviour is therefore genuinely unpredictable to him in a way that nothing else is. He is said to hate them above all other species, which, for a being with limited access to the emotional register, is quite a statement. The Nihilach dynasty presents a different face of the Necron awakening. First, they emerged from the Great Sleep to find their ancient territories occupied, not devastated, not in ruins beyond recognition, simply lived in by people who had no idea the land they were farming, and the cities they were building, and the systems they were settling, had owners far older than their civilization itself. The Nihilach's response to this is territorial in the most absolute sense. What is theirs, was always theirs, will always be theirs, and the presence of others on that territory is a problem to be addressed with whatever level of force the situation requires. They hold ground with a ferocity that makes other dynasties look flexible. Trazyn the Infinite, nominally of the Nihilach, is one of the most recognizable figures in all of Necron lore, and he deserves his reputation for complexity. Trazyn is a collector, not in the casual sense of a person who picks up interesting things, in the all-consuming, life-defining, civilization-building sense of someone for whom the accumulation and preservation of significant objects and moments is the primary axis of their entire existence. His crown world of Solemnace contains, within its vast subterranean galleries, the largest museum in the history of the galaxy. Artifacts from civilizations that no other record confirms ever existed. Specimens of species long extinct, preserved in perfect stasis. Entire historical scenes reproduced with living subjects frozen in the moment. Battles, ceremonies, meetings of historical significance, captured and arrayed for his private viewing as a gallery of everything interesting that has ever happened. Trazyn is not violent for violence's sake. When he becomes violent, it is usually because something he wants for the collection is inconveniently attached to someone who objects to being part of it, or because someone has wandered into his galleries uninvited. He has, on at least one notable occasion, deployed facsimile versions of historical figures from his collection onto distant battlefields as a form of improvisational military assistance, apparently finding the practical application of his archives more interesting than simply letting them sit. His motivations are genuinely difficult to predict, governed almost entirely by the question of whether any given situation might produce something worth acquiring. He has a peculiar and somewhat rueful relationship with the archivists of the Adeptus Mechanicus, who share some of his obsessions while lacking his resources, and who have not yet fully processed the implications of what they are dealing with. Nemesor Zandrech of Gidrim is the character who reminds you that Necron lore is not uniformly grim. He is a military commander of formidable capacity, a Necron noble of the Sautek dynasty who has fought with Imhotep's forces across dozens of campaigns and contributed substantially to the Sautek's reputation for tactical excellence. He is also, in any meaningful sense of the word, lost. His cognitive state on awakening from the Great Sleep was a specific kind of damaged, not the scattered engram dissolution of the truly broken, but a precision malfunction that left his abilities intact while destroying his connection to the present. Zandrech is absolutely convinced, with a conviction that no amount of evidence can disturb, that he is still fighting the ancient wars of secession among the Necrontyre. He addresses enemy space marines as rebellious Necrontyre nobles, whose dynasties have gotten above themselves. He grants formal quarter to defeated human soldiers in accordance with protocols 65 million years obsolete. His Vargard Oberon follows him with an absolute devotion that has nothing of pity in it and everything of loyalty, gently managing the most dangerous expressions of his lord's confusion without ever confronting the confusion itself, because the confusion is Zandrech and Zandrech is his lord, and to cure the condition would be to replace the person. Zandrech is not a tragedy in the way the Destroyers or the Flayed Ones are tragedies. What he is something stranger and more touching, a being whose damage has left him with more of his original self than the undamaged are sometimes able to carry. Part 8. The madness that came with sleep. Destroyers and the Flayed Ones. Some Necrons woke up broken in specific, identifiable ways that the lore has named and described with the clinical precision you would expect from a civilization of machine intelligences trying to understand and categorize what has happened to their own people. The Destroyer cult is the result of a particular kind of cognitive failure, one that does not touch the Necrons' tactical function, does not diminish their physical capability, does not impair the systems that make them effective in combat. What it touches is the meaning behind the function, the reason for fighting, and the purpose that gets a warrior up in the morning in the metaphorical sense and points them at an enemy in the literal one. Destroyers have lost that meaning, or rather, they have replaced it with a meaning of their own, the elimination of all life, not a selective elimination, not a focused, tactical removal of specific threats. All life, every biological organism on every world they encounter, worked through systematically from the largest to the microscopic, leaving the kind of silence that they themselves embody. The Destroyer does not hate the living in the way that a person hates an enemy. Hatred is a feeling, and the Destroyers have simplified themselves beyond the capacity for feeling, but by a process that the lore describes as being possibly hardwired into their psychology during the biotransference, a subconscious imperative toward nihilism that emerges catastrophically in those Necrons whose grip on their own sense of purpose weakens enough to let it through. They do not even hate themselves, though by their own stated logic they should. The Destroyers are technically among the living, housed in mechanical forms that maintain the function of life, if not its warmth. They include themselves in the category of things that should not exist. The most extreme among them will eventually seek their own destruction after completing enough of their harvest to satisfy whatever passes for conscience in a being whose conscience has been replaced with something like mathematics. While other Necrons regard the destroyers with a compound of reactions that the lore captures in the quote attributed to a Necron overlord who managed to articulate it. Approval for their drive and efficiency, which is genuine, and a specific kind of horror at what they represent, which is also genuine. The destroyers are what happens when a mind that was already damaged by the biotransference, already hollowed by the Great Sleep, reaches the point where the only thing still generating anything resembling purpose is the act of ending other things. They are the endpoint of a trajectory that every Necron is theoretically on, and the sight of them is a reminder of what that endpoint looks like. They are also, perversely useful, pointed at a world that needs to be cleansed. What a destroyer cult will do the job with a thoroughness that even Necron legions operating under more conventional directives would find excessive. They work down through the biosphere to the microbial level. They do not leave. Then there are the flayed ones, and the flayed ones are a different kind of problem entirely. The Citan Landugor, the Flayer, was the only Citan to be truly destroyed in the Necron revolt, rather than merely shattered. Not sharded, destroyed, obliterated, but in the milliseconds before that obliteration, he issued a curse, a genuine curse, in the sense that its effects are real and persistent and spreading, whatever the mechanism by which it operates. He called it a gift, this curse, and described it in terms of love turned to hatred and hunger extended through time as a form of justice. So what the Flayer virus does to a Necron is give it hunger, not the abstract computational drive of a system seeking resources. A specific, overwhelming, total hunger for flesh, for the warm, biological substance that the Necrons surrendered in the fires of the biotransference 65 million years ago. The infected Necron begins to kill, driven by this hunger. But killing is not the end of the drive, because the drive is not for killing. It is for what killing produces, and what killing produces in organic bodies is flesh, and the flayed one cannot stop reaching for it. It cannot digest. It cannot absorb. The blood seeps through the gaps in its chassis and pools at its feet. The flesh it tears apart falls away unused. The hunger does not abate. And no amount of organic matter consumed or worn or draped over the mechanical body can fill the specific absence that the biotransference left, the soul, the warmth, the basic and irreplaceable quality of being alive in the biological sense. The flayed one wears the skins of its victims. This is not designed behavior. It is not a deliberate tactical choice or an expression of psychological intent. It is the expression of an absence so profound and so irreparable that the infected Necron reaches, again and again, for a substitute it knows will not work, driven by an imperative that cannot be argued with because it operates below the level of argument. It reaches for flesh because it remembers flesh, in whatever dim and corrupted way the biotransference left memories of what the Necrontire were. The Flayer virus spreads through contact with living metal, which means that other Necrons fear the flayed ones in a very immediate and practical way. Not just the existential horror of what they represent, the practical, immediate danger of proximity. Any Necron suspected of beginning to succumb to the Flayer virus is banished or destroyed before the infection can progress, though the Necron's own regenerative biology means that destruction is rarely permanent, and many flayed ones survive the attempted cullings and retreat to the pocket dimensions they inhabit between hunts. There are flayed one kings, nobles who contracted the virus but retained enough of their original cognitive architecture that the madness coexists with intelligence. Ortfagul the Fallen Lord rules the Bone Kingdom of Drazak in this condition, a Pharaon-class intelligence in a flayed one's body, organizing his subjects into something resembling a civilization, dispatching them on what he calls times of bounty. He is aware of what he is. He cannot stop it. He does the best he can with what remains. Part 9. The Silent King returns while his people slept. Zarek sailed. He sailed out of the galaxy entirely. past the outer spiral arms, and the halo stars into the intergalactic void, where the distances between things are so vast that the light from the nearest stars takes millions of years to cross them. He sailed in the Song of Oblivion, his flagship, as the ship that had been built for a civilization that no longer existed in any form it would recognize, through the absolute dark of the space between galaxies, where there is nothing but the faint background radiation of the universe itself, and the occasional remote smear of light that tells you a galaxy exists somewhere far away. We do not know what he thought in 60 million years of that. The Lord does not give us his interior monologue from the void, and this is probably intentional. What goes on in the mind of a being with 60 million years of solitude to fill, carrying the knowledge of what he did to his people, sailing away from the consequences as a form of penance that also conveniently deferred facing them. This is not something the law is in the business of describing directly. It leaves it to silence and inference. What we know is that at some point in the intergalactic dark, Sarek found the Tyranids, not the great hive fleets in their full form. Those would not reach the Milky Way for millions of years after the Great Sleep ended. What he found was the vanguard, the forward elements, the things the Tyranid intelligence sends ahead of the main consumption event to scout and soften. Organic, biological, utterly alien in a way that went beyond species differences into something that challenged category itself. Living weapons, shaped by a collective intelligence that operated on scales of time and space that even Sarek's 60 million year perspective had not fully prepared him for. He recognized them for what they were immediately, an existential threat. Not to life in general. Sarek's concern for life in general has always been instrumental rather than genuine, but to his plan, to the dream that he had been nursing through 60 million years of exile, find organic species whose bodies could house Necron consciousness and give back to his people what the biotransference had taken, reverse the curse, return the flesh. If the Tyranids consumed all life in the Milky Way galaxy, that plan would be impossible. There would be no bodies to return to, no biological substrate to offer to the Necron minds still trapped in their metal prisons. There would be nothing left but the Necrons themselves, eternal and empty, ruling a galaxy that was itself empty forever. Sarek returned in the year 744 Emsa 41. He returned quietly, moving through the galaxy in disguise, working through Triarch Praetorians who recognized the authority of their long-absent monarch, and through unsuspecting overlords and cryptex who did not know who was pulling their strings. He observed, he assessed, he found his inheritance in worse condition than his most pessimistic calculations had projected. Many tomb worlds still sleeping, many more lost entirely. The dynasties that had awakened fighting each other as often as they fought the other species of the galaxy. The Great Rift, a catastrophic tear in real space caused by the culmination of 10,000 years of psychic pressure. A wound in reality that the 41st Millennium will call the Cicatrix Maledictum, had split the galaxy in half and disrupted the slow re-establishment of contact between dynasties. He eventually revealed himself. Not dramatically. The Silent King's return was not announced with pomp or ceremony, because pomp and ceremony are the language of beings who want to be seen, and Sarek had been watching for centuries before he was ready to be seen. When he declared himself openly, he did so with the authority of the Triarch, reforming the ruling council with 2 new members, mounting the dais of dominion, and making clear that the Silent King had returned and the Necron race had a monarch again. Atop the dais, accompanying him as an unmistakable statement about power and captivity, sits a bound Titan shard in a containment vessel, a god in a bottle, a reminder of what the Necrons are capable of and what the dynasty of the Silent King has already accomplished. The response has been complicated. Imhotep the Stormlord, who had fashioned himself as the great unifier of the Necron race in Sarek's absence, and who had no intention of being eclipsed by a returned monarch he had never answered to, revolted openly during the war in the Pariah Nexus. The tension between these 2 enormous presences, the returned king carrying 65 million years of guilt, and a plan that requires the preservation of life throughout the galaxy. And the conqueror who built his empire from nothing and sees no reason to subordinate it to anyone is one of the great ongoing conflicts within Necron civilization. Sarek also operates in a dimension of pragmatism that some of his fellow Necrons find baffling. He will ally with other species when it serves his purposes. He has fought alongside the Blood Angels against Tyranid incursions. He is protecting human lives not out of affection for humanity, but out of the cold arithmetic of needing those lives to exist in the future. He has communicated with Imperial commanders, offered temporary truces, pulled his forces back from conflicts that would have produced Necron victories, but would have left the galaxy in a worse position for the longer game he is playing. The galaxy does not fully understand what it is dealing with. The individual encountered Necron awakenings are terrifying enough. The full scope of what the Great Awakening represents, billions upon billions of Necrons beginning to stir across hundreds of worlds, armed with technology that surpasses anything the living civilizations of the 41st millennium can produce. As led by a monarch who has been playing the long game for 65 million years and who is not finished, is a picture that no faction in the setting has yet assembled into clear focus. Part 10. The Galaxy Trembles. What the Awakening means for everyone, let us step back from the individual stories. Let us take the widest possible view of what the Necron Awakening actually means for the 41st millennium, for all the species scrambling to survive in this most violent and pressured age of the galaxy's long history. The Imperium of man controls, nominally, millions of worlds. It is the largest human civilization in history, maintained by institutional inertia as much as by genuine cohesion, supported by the tremendous military apparatus of Space Marines and the Astra Militarum and the Adeptus Mechanicus and all the other organizations that keep the machinery of governance functioning. It is tired. It has been fighting on every front simultaneously for 10,000 years. The Great Rift has bisected its territory and disrupted communication and supply between the two halves of an empire, never particularly well coordinated even when it was whole. What the Imperium does not know, in any unified and actionable sense, is the true scale of the Necron presence beneath the worlds it controls. A significant percentage of inhabited Imperial worlds are tomb worlds. Worlds where, beneath the cities and the farms and the cathedrals and the manufactorums, something from before human civilization is sleeping and beginning to stir. The intelligence about Necrons that exists within the Imperium is fragmentary, classified at multiple levels, distributed among the Inquisition and the Adeptus Mechanicus and specific Space Marine chapters that have encountered them, and almost never consolidated into a picture that would allow anyone to understand the full scale of what is happening. Individual tomb world awakenings have been documented. Individual systems have been quarantined or subjected to exterminatus when Necron activity was confirmed and could not be halted. But the idea that this is not a series of isolated incidents, but the leading edge of a species-wide awakening, that the Necrons might number not in the thousands encountered so far, but in the hundreds of billions sleeping beneath the galaxy's surface, is a conclusion that the Imperium's institutional knowledge structures are not equipped to reach, let alone act on. The Adeptus Mechanicus knows more. They have found Necron technology beneath Mars itself, traces of a presence older than the Imperium, older than humanity's time on the Red Planet. The Void Dragon, one of the most powerful of the original Citan, is believed to have been imprisoned beneath the surface of Mars by the Emperor in the distant past. Yet the investigations the Mechanicus have conducted into these findings are conducted with an obsessive secrecy that reflects both genuine security concerns and the deeply uncomfortable possibility that some of the technology they have spent millennia reverse engineering and calling the gifts of the Omnissiah is the residual output of a civilization 65 million years older than their own. The Eldari know the most and have known it the longest. The knowledge of the Necrons, of the war in heaven, of what the Necrons are and what their return will mean, is part of the core of Eldari culture and religion in ways that have shaped their civilization's relationship with the galaxy for as long as that civilization has existed. Aeldari farseers watch tomb complexes. They monitor signs of increasing activity. They conduct raids when they detect a tomb world close to activation, trying to destroy or delay the revivification sequence. They have been doing this for as long as they have had the capability. It has not been enough. The scale is wrong. There are too many worlds, too many tombs, too much already woken or waking for the diminished Aeldari civilization of the 41st millennium to address. What happens when the Necrons arrive in force on a world is by now documented in enough Imperial records to identify the pattern. The first signs are easy to miss. Individuals disappearing, power systems behaving strangely, communication interference at odd frequencies, soil disturbances in areas that should have nothing to disturb them. Then the automated systems of the tomb begin interacting with the surface, not aggressively yet, just present. Use the peripheral effects of something vast awakening below. The people living on the world generate explanations. Equipment failure, geological phenomena, something the local tech priests will sort out eventually. Then the warriors emerge, not dramatically, not with the thunderous violence of an orbital bombardment or the screaming horror of a chaos manifestation. The Necrons come up from the ground with the inevitability of something geological, slow, quiet, impossible to negotiate with, and impossible to stop once the motion has fully begun. A patrol of Necron warriors, stepping from a hillside that cracked open in the night. A line of emerald light stitching across a darkened field as Gauss weapons eliminated a scouting party that walked too close. The sound, if any humans survived to report on it, were described as the grinding of metal on stone, and the high, thin harmonics of ancient systems running at power for the first time in millions of years. When the full scale becomes clear, when air support cannot penetrate the interference field the tomb mind has erected over its complex, when tanks find their vehicles being consumed from the treads upward by scarab swarms materializing from the ground itself, when infantry understand that the enemies they are shooting are standing back up, it is usually too late for the kind of resistance that might have changed the outcome. The Necron monolith, the great floating fortress of living metal that serves as battlefield anchor and command node for a Necron force, is perhaps the most visible expression of the difference between fighting Necrons and fighting any other opponent, as it descends from the sky, or rises from the earth in some cases, phasing up through the ground itself, with a weight and a presence that communicates something beyond military force. It communicates ownership. The Eternity Gate at its heart allows warriors to be pulled back from across the battlefield and returned to the tomb for repair and redeployment. The monolith does not need to win battles. It needs to maintain presence. It needs to demonstrate that this world is already claimed, has always been claimed, and will continue to be claimed regardless of what the current inhabitants attempt. The reanimation protocols, the automated self-repair systems built into every Necron from the warriors up through the overlords, are what make this presence sustainable against opposition. A Necron that takes enough damage to stop functioning phases out, teleported back to the tomb complex in a burst of green light, deposited into a repair facility, rebuilt, and eventually returned to service. The green sparks that surround a damaged Necron warrior, the way a destroyed body begins to pull itself back together in the middle of a firefight while its companions continue advancing without missing a step. This is not a regeneration ability in the biological sense. It is logistics. It is the visible expression of a supply chain so efficient and so deeply embedded in the very substance of the battlefield that it cannot be interdicted by anything the enemy has available. Fighting the Necrons has been compared by Imperial tacticians to fighting a tide. But you dig trenches and build walls and pour everything you have into holding the line, and the tide does not regroup in the human sense, does not need to be convinced that the fight is still worth fighting. It simply keeps coming. Part 11. The Horror and the Sorrow. What the Necrons mean. We have walked through a great deal of ground tonight. We have gone from the beginning, from a people cursed by the star they were born beneath, whose suffering produced both their greatness and their ruin, through their desperate bargain, their ancient war, their long sleep in the dark, and the slow and terrible and uneven process of their waking. We have met the greatest of them and the most broken of them, the quietly eccentric and the deliberately terrifying, as the ancient king in exile and the general who built an empire in the morning of his return. But I want to spend some time, as we approach the end of this conversation, with what the Necrons mean, not tactically, not militarily, in the deeper sense, the sense that, if you let yourself sit with the lore long enough, makes the Necrons one of the most genuinely affecting factions in any science fiction setting I have encountered. The Necrons are not a story about evil, they are a story about a mistake that cannot be undone. The Necrontyr were not monsters. They were not, in origin or in nature, the kind of beings who deserved the fate they received. They were a people who suffered, who were defined by that suffering in ways they could not escape. And who wanted, with the urgency of short lives, what every mortal being wants at some level: more time, more life, less pain, the chance to matter beyond the span of a few decades under a killing sun. They asked for help from beings who had what they needed, and they were told no, and they went to war, and they lost. And in their desperation they accepted an offer from something that knew precisely what they would sacrifice for the chance to be free of what had always been killing them. This is not a rare story. It is one of the oldest stories there is. The difference is scale. When the Necrontyr paid the price for their mistake, the bill was not just their own lives and their own choices. It was 65 million years of their civilization, to the souls of billions of people who went into the biofoundries as living beings and came out as machines. The warmth and grief and love and connection and all the unmeasurable things that make a civilization something more than the sum of its technology. Zarek carries this. He has carried it for 65 million years. The king who said yes, who stood at the entrance of the furnaces and watched his people walk in, who emerged himself on the other side and understood in the first moment of his new and permanent existence exactly what he had done. He cannot undo it. He can perhaps eventually, if the plan works, if the tyrannids are stopped, if organic species survive long enough to provide the vessels he needs, if the Necron technology is sufficient, mitigate it. He can perhaps give back to whoever wants it the flesh that was taken. He cannot give back the 65 million years. He cannot give back the soul that was consumed. He cannot unring the bell. The warrior who marches in the phalanx behind an overlord is perhaps the most quietly devastating figure in all of this. Not the destroyer with his violent philosophical conclusion, not the flayed one with its specific and monstrous grief. The warrior, the Necron equivalent of an ordinary person, the farmer or craftsperson or laborer, who went into the furnace and came out simplified, stripped of most of what they had been, left with just enough awareness to know, in dim and fragmentary flashes, that something is missing. The lore notes this specifically and without embellishment. Even the lowliest Necron warrior retains a tiny spark of self-awareness, just enough to be haunted by the vague memory of the past it once knew. For these, death would be preferable, but they no longer have the wit to recognize that, or the autonomy to pursue it. What do you do with that information? What do you do with the knowledge that the enemy advancing across the battlefield toward you is, in some cases, carrying inside their metal chassis the ghost of a person who did not choose this and cannot escape it? The 40,000 universe is not in the business of easy answers to questions like that. The Necrons fight, and the living fight, and the galaxy continues to grind forward on its bloody track. And underneath it all, this vast civilizational tragedy just keeps waking up, one tomb at a time, into a present it cannot change and a past it cannot leave behind. The Necrons ask, in everything they do, a question that has no comfortable answer. What is left of you after everything that made you who you were has been taken away? Can you still be called yourself? Can the Necrontyr who walks in and the Necron who walks out be said to be the same being? Can a people be called alive when what animates them is not souls but physics, not desire but programming, not love, but the engrammatic echo of love encoded into systems that run because they were designed to run, not because they want to? These are not questions with answers in the text. They are questions the text holds open, permanently, as a kind of invitation to sit with discomfort that does not resolve. The Necrons wake, and they build, and they fight, and they mourn in whatever diminished register mourning is still available to them, and the galaxy watches. And nobody is quite sure what to make of it, which is exactly right, because the Necrons are real, in the sense that fiction can be real. They illuminate something true. The fear of becoming unrecognizable to yourself, the horror of losing what made you human, the grief of being unable to undo the choice that led you here, and the stubborn, mechanical, perhaps meaningless, or perhaps the most meaningful thing in the universe, insistence on continuing anyway, on building what you can build with what you have left, on carrying the debt forward because there is no one else to carry it. 65 million years after the furnaces were lit, the last of the Silent King sails through a broken galaxy. His people wake behind him in fits and fragments, damaged and dangerous and sorrowful in ways that most of them can no longer fully register. The stars have changed. The civilizations they remembered are gone. The galaxy they went under to preserve their claim on is unrecognizable from the one they built their empire in. But they are still here, still waking, still carrying, in their hollow metal bodies, the echo of everything they were. The Necrons are not just waking up, they are coming home. Thank you so much for spending this time with me tonight. If you made it all the way to the end, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. The kind who wants to really sit with the lore, to let it breathe, to feel the weight of a story told across 65 million years of imagined history. The Necrons are one of the richest and most carefully built factions in all of Warhammer 40,000. And I hope tonight we did some justice to what makes them so extraordinary, not just as an enemy faction, not just as a cool army with great models, but as a meditation on time and loss and what survives when everything comfortable has been stripped away. If this helped you relax, if it kept you company while you wound down from a long day, please consider leaving a like on the video. It genuinely matters for a channel like this one, and it helps other people find their way here. And if you want to stay with Q on 40,000 for everything that is coming, and there is always more to come, because the 40,000 universe is bottomless in the best possible way, hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell if you want to be notified when we go deep like this again. We will keep doing this. We will keep going into the dark corners of the lore and staying there long enough for your eyes to adjust. Because the best stories are the ones that change what you see when you come back out. Rest well, sleep soundly, and remember that whatever might be sleeping beneath the world you live on has probably been there longer than you think. Good night. Extended notes and elaborations. The full picture, the Necrontyre's civilization before the war. A deeper look to truly appreciate the tragedy of the Necrons, we need to spend more time with who the Necrontyre were before the furnaces claimed them. We have touched on their suffering under their star's radiation, on the brevity and pain of their lives. But there is more to understand about what they built in the shadow of that suffering. And because it was a civilization of genuine and remarkable achievement that makes its loss feel proportionate to the scale of its tragedy. The Necrontyre were, by the time they came into conflict with the Old Ones, a mature and expansive interstellar civilization. Their technology was not primitive. Their torch ships, clad in the living metal of necrodermis that resisted the hard radiation of space travel better than any organic-based shielding, carried them across the stars and allowed them to colonize worlds that would have been inaccessible to less advanced species. Their weapons were sophisticated. Their understanding of physics was deep. They had stasis crypt technology capable of preserving a person across the vast timescales of interstellar travel, which speaks to a civilization that had been working seriously on the problem of biological preservation for a very long time. They also had art. They had music and poetry, and the kinds of cultural production that emerge when a species has been building civilization long enough that the basics of survival are handled and there is energy left over for beauty. The particular character of Necrontyre art, given what we know of their culture's obsession with death and legacy, was probably monumental and elegiac, things built to outlast their makers, things designed to still be meaningful to whoever might come along thousands of years later and encounter them. The Great Tomb is not a metaphor in Necron culture. It is the pinnacle of artistic achievement, since it is what a successful life looks like. Something built in your name that will be standing long after you are gone. And they had humor, they had philosophy, they had, almost certainly, the same range of human-adjacent experience that any species intelligent enough to build starships and maintain complex societies would have. People who loved each other, who made each other laugh, who stayed up late arguing about things that seemed important to them and would never seem important to anyone else. People who had favorite foods and hated specific sounds and were absolutely convinced that their particular dynasty's approach to governance was obviously superior to everyone else's, and were wrong, and knew they were wrong, and argued for it anyway because that is what people do. All of this went into the furnaces. Or all of this was consumed by the Satan, or scattered by the incomplete transfer of consciousness into metal, simplified and diminished and hollowed out, until what was left was capable and immortal and empty of the specific, irreplaceable texture of being those particular people. The Necron did not become the Necrons. The Necrons were something new, built from the materials of the Necron, but no longer them in any meaningful sense. Zarek understood this immediately, in the moment of his own transformation. He had killed his people to save them, and what he had saved was not them. This is the foundational grief of the entire Necron narrative, and it is worth sitting with fully before moving on, because everything else flows from it. Every battle the Necrons fight, every dynasty they rebuild, every tomb world they reclaim, as is downstream of this one catastrophic moment when a civilization made an irreversible choice and the universe let it stand. Necron technology. A closer examination, the Necrons are, without any serious competition, the most technologically advanced civilization in the contemporary timeline of Warhammer 40,000. This is not a matter of dispute within the lore. The Adeptus Mechanicus, with all their millennia of reverse engineering, cannot replicate what the Necrons build. The Eldari, with all their ancient grace and psychic mastery, do not possess material technology that matches the Necrons. Even the Tau, the youngest, and in some ways most dynamically developing civilization in the setting, are playing in a different league. The gap is not close. But the Necrons' material science makes the Imperium's most advanced achievements look roughly equivalent to pointing at something and making a loud noise. This is not hyperbole. It is the considered position of Warhammer 40,000 lore, stated plainly in multiple sources. The cornerstone of it all is necrodermis, living metal in the most literal sense the term can bear. Not metal that contains living things. Not metal that has been processed by living things. Metal that is itself, in some fundamental and not entirely understood way, alive. Or at least alive adjacent. The nanoscale structure of necrodermis is self-repairing, self-modifying, responsive to the will of the Necron it comprises or the intelligence that directs it. A Necron warrior whose arm is severed in battle does not bleed out. The wound seals, and over the course of seconds to minutes, the severed limb is either reattached or replaced by material that flows from elsewhere in the body. Shot through the torso with a weapon that would punch through power armor, the Necron warrior staggers, and then the metal flows to seal the breach, and the warrior continues walking. This is not regeneration in the biological sense. It is engineering at a scale and precision that the Mechanicus, for all their study of the pieces of Necron technology they have encountered, cannot fully replicate. The nanoscarabs, microscopic versions of the larger canoptech constructs that live within the necrodermis of every Necron, are the mechanism. Billions of tiny machines performing repair operations at the molecular level, continuously and automatically, which responding to damage faster than damage can accumulate under most combat conditions. The Gauss weapons that arm even the most basic Necron warriors are themselves extraordinary. A Gauss flare does not fire a projectile in any conventional sense, and it does not fire a laser or plasma beam in the conventional sense either. What it does is interact with the molecular bonds of its target and encourage them, with increasing urgency, to let go. The effect is visible as matter disassembling, armor plating, or biological tissue, or ceramite, or ferrocrete. It makes little difference, stripping away layer by layer, particle by particle, as the Gauss field works its way through whatever it touches. A sustained hit from a Gauss weapon will disassemble a Space Marine's power armor and then the Space Marine inside it with an efficiency that has been described by survivors of Necron encounters as watching something being erased. The more advanced weapons in the Necron arsenal scale this principle up dramatically. Gauss destructors on heavy vehicles, particle beam weapons, and Tesla coils at various scales, and the exotic technologies that Cryptex, the Necron scientist engineers, develop for specific purposes. The celestial orrery, at the heart of the Oroska dynasty's crown world of Thanatos, is a machine that contains a representation of every star in the galaxy, and altering that representation causes corresponding changes to the actual star, up to and including triggering premature supernovae. The world engine was a tomb world that the Necrons converted into a mobile fortress roughly the size of a small moon, scoured inhabited worlds of all life, while its void shields deflected everything the Imperium could throw at it for years before it was finally breached and destroyed from the inside by Space Marines at enormous cost. The Monolith, the Ghost Ark, the Night Scythe transport, the Doom Scythe attack craft, the Triarch Stalker with its targeting relay that coordinates the fire of entire armies, the Transcendent Citan, a shard of a captured god wielded as the most terrifying battlefield weapon available to any Necron commander willing to accept the risk of directing divine madness. Each piece of this arsenal is extraordinary by the standards of any other civilization, and it is all backed by the reanimation protocols and the necrodermis that makes Necron forces so difficult to permanently reduce. What makes this particularly interesting from a lore perspective is that the Necrons are not actually innovating anymore. Their technology was developed before the Great Sleep and, with the exception of modifications made by individual cryptex working on specific problems since the Awakening, has not fundamentally advanced. The Great Sleep and the cognitive degradation it caused has meant that many of the Necrons who possess the scientific knowledge to develop new technology are no longer capable of holding those thoughts. The cryptex who work today reverse engineer the pre-sleep designs as often as they develop new ones. The Necrons are, in a real sense, living off the intellectual capital of a civilization that no longer fully exists, wielding weapons built by people who died in the furnaces, whose knowledge and creativity and scientific intuition went with them into the consuming fire of biotransference. This is another layer of the tragedy. The most advanced technology in the galaxy was made by people who are, in the most meaningful sense, no longer around to understand how it works. The fate of individual dynasties. More stories from the dark. The galaxy, in the late 41st millennium, holds dozens of partially or fully awakened Necron dynasties in various stages of reclaiming their presence. Each has its own story. Each bears the marks of its particular history in ways that make the diversity of Necron civilization as interesting as its horror. The Maynarch dynasty is one of the more extensively documented in the lore, and their story illustrates the range of what the Great Sleep and its aftermath can look like. The Maynarch are among the most direct and aggressive of the awakened dynasties. Their campaign in the Orpheus sector, documented in considerable detail in Imperial records, as one of the most devastating Necron incursions of the 41st millennium. Their forces under Kutlak the World Killer and the Ferak Sunbakir, the Mother of Oblivion, moved through the sector with an efficiency that suggests not disorientation on waking, but a very clear sense of purpose, carried intact across the sleep. They also suffer disproportionately from the Flayer curse, the Maynarch dynasty being specifically linked in the lore to the destruction of Landugor the Flayer. And the curse he left on dying has an outsized presence among their warriors, which the living nobility of the dynasty manages with varying degrees of success. The Suchbeker dynasty presents a different kind of strange. Their overlord Achmontech went to sleep angry, specifically burning with resentment toward their rivals, the Charnovok dynasty, over disputes that had not been resolved before the Great Sleep began. This anger, encoded into Achmontek's subconscious processing during the sleep, expressed itself catastrophically. His own Tomb World's command codes were gradually and unconsciously degraded by the intensity of his unresolved emotional state, rendering most of the dynasty's automated systems non-functional in ways that their Necrons have been manually rebuilding ever since. The Subekhar function today as a covert operation, are manipulating events in their sectors from behind the scenes, while their visible infrastructure remains too damaged for direct conflict. It is a remarkable case of psychology, or what remains of it, overcoming engineering. The Nephrek dynasty are notable for a different reason. They are among those dynasties actively pursuing the reversal of biotransference, or at least the development of alternative organic hosting options that might give at least some Necrons a path back to biological existence. The Nephrek bask in the light of their crown world's trinary star system and have developed their solar energy absorption and distribution technology to extraordinary levels, but their real long-term project is finding a way out of the metal bodies that contain them. In this goal, they are aligned with Sarek's own ambitions, and making them natural allies of the Silent King in ways that the more territorially focused dynasties are not. And there are the Severed, not a dynasty in the conventional sense, but a loose collection of what happens when the tomb mind of a world loses coherence and takes over in the absence of functioning Necron consciousness. The Sarkoni Emperor is one version of this, the master program of the world of Sarkon, damaged beyond its intended parameters by radiation storms during the Great Sleep, interpreted its directive to maintain order as a mandate to expand order outward, and has spent the centuries since awakening conquering nearby worlds to bring them under its administrative dominion, using mind-shackle scarabs to make the inhabitants compliant rather than destroying them. We're building an empire of living puppets managed by a system that does not understand what it has become. How other factions experience the Necron awakening, the Aeldari have the longest and most complex relationship with the Necron awakening because they have been anticipating it for the entirety of their post-fall civilization. The Farseers of the surviving craft worlds have been monitoring Tomb World activity, running probability calculations on which worlds will activate and when, and occasionally physically intervening to delay or prevent specific awakenings. They have had centuries to prepare, and it has not been enough. Part of what makes the Aeldari relationship with the Necrons particularly textured is the memory of the war in heaven. The Aeldari were created partly to fight the Necrons, remember? That their very existence as a species is linked to the conflict. The war in heaven is not ancient history to the Aeldari, the way it might be to a human who has never encountered it. It is part of the foundational myth history that structures Aeldari culture, and the Necrons are the enemy they were made to fight, reawakened, with the technology and the intention to reclaim everything the Aeldari currently inhabit. The Space Marines who have encountered Necron forces have almost universally come away from those encounters changed. Not in the mystical sense. Space Marines are heavily psycho-resistant, and Necrons don't use psychic warfare in any conventional way, but in the sense of having encountered an opponent that does not work by the rules they were trained for. You cannot break a Necron's morale because it does not have morale in any exploitable sense. You cannot exhaust them or outpace their logistics in a conventional campaign. You cannot use shock and awe because the shock of a weapon impact is real, but the awe requires something to be awed, and Necron warriors process incoming fire as damage data rather than as anything emotionally meaningful. Chapters that have fought the Necrons extensively, the Ultramarines, the Iron Hands, the Death Spectres, have developed tactics and doctrines specific to Necron engagements. They target the Canoptech constructs to disrupt the reanimation support systems. They concentrate fire to achieve the threshold of damage needed to prevent a phase-out, destroying Necrons thoroughly enough that the repair systems cannot save them, as they try to target and isolate the Overlord or Cryptek directing the force, because Necron warriors operating without command direction default to their last instruction and become dramatically less effective. They use speed and aggressive flanking to disrupt the two minds' ability to allocate forces effectively. None of this is a solution, it is adaptation. The Necrons are not going to stop awakening because the Space Marines have developed better anti-Necron tactics. The tactical question and the strategic question are, in the Necrons' case, very different from each other. And winning on the tactical level, which is hard and costly, does not address the strategic reality of what is happening beneath the surface of the galaxy. The Orcs are, as Imhotep has noted, deeply anomalous in this context. Since they fight the Necrons because fighting is what the Orcs do, and they fight them with the particular greenskin combination of enormous physical resilience, constant forward aggression, and complete indifference to outcomes. An Orc who falls in battle against a Necron warrior does not philosophically reconsider the engagement. His mates simply continue the fight because the fight is the point. The unpredictability that Imhotep finds so frustrating is genuine and profound. Orc battle doctrine, to the extent the Orcs have doctrine, is essentially random in ways that defeat logical modelling. And Necron tactical planning is built almost entirely on logical modelling. The Tau, the youngest of the major starfaring civilizations, have had relatively limited encounters with the Necrons so far. Yet because most of their territory is in the eastern fringe of the galaxy where fewer tomb worlds are located. But where those encounters have happened, they have been educational. The Tau concept of the greater good, the diplomatic and philosophical framework around which their civilization is organized, does not translate well to the Necron worldview. The Tau have achieved coalition building with several other species, including some they were originally at war with. The Necrons are not interested in coalition building. The Necrons are interested in reclamation. The Tyranids, approaching from the galactic fringe, represent the threat that concerns the Silent King most. And they do not interact with the Necrons in conventional military terms. The Tyranid hive mind and the Necron tomb mind are such different forms of intelligence that the engagement between them is almost more like two environmental forces meeting than two armies. The Tyranids consume biomass. The Necrons are not biomass. The Tyranids are therefore not particularly interested in Necron worlds for their primary purpose. But they devour everything biological around the Necron worlds, and what they leave behind is a galaxy increasingly devoid of the organic life that the Necrons need for their long game. The game of finding new flesh, reversing the biotransference, and giving back to their people what the furnaces took. And the inner life of a Necron, what is it like to be one? We spend most of our time in Necron lore looking at them from the outside, understanding the military and strategic dimensions, cataloguing their history and their technology and their factions. We encounter them as opponents, as threats, as ancient and terrible forces, whose motivations we analyze from a position of comfortable distance. But what is it actually like to be one? The lore, in its more philosophical moments, touches on this. The Necron novel, The Infinite and the Divine, by Robert Rath, which follows Trazyn the Infinite and Orican the Diviner across thousands of years of their existence, is perhaps the most sustained and thoughtful examination of what Necron consciousness is actually like from the inside. What it presents is not the cold and empty void that the outsider perspective would suggest. It is something stranger and more interesting than that. Trazyn experiences something. He experiences intellectual satisfaction in the acquisition of a rare specimen. He experiences something adjacent to aesthetic appreciation when he encounters a particularly well-crafted historical tableau. He experiences frustration when his plans fail, and a cold species of satisfaction when they succeed. What he does not appear to experience, at least not in ways that map cleanly onto organic emotional categories, is warmth, the kind of felt connection to other beings that biological psychology produces through neurochemistry and hormonal response, and the basic physical experience of sharing space with other warm bodies. Trazyn's relationships, such as they are intellectual rather than emotional. His regard for Orican is real, in the sense that it affects his behavior and his decisions, but it does not feel like love or friendship in the organic sense. It feels like interest, very sustained, very specific interest. Orican is different. The diviner is a being who has spent so long modeling the future that his grip on the present is somewhat tenuous, and his relationship with his own emotions, such as they are, is complicated by his awareness that he has already, in some sense, experienced this conversation before. Orikan's version of feeling seems to come in compressed, intense bursts, separated by long stretches of the cold calculation that is his default state. He does not seem to enjoy his own existence in any consistent way, as he tolerates it with something that might be described as resigned competence. The Necron warrior at the lowest level of the hierarchy experiences something even further removed from organic emotional life. The lore is specific about this. The tiny spark of self-awareness that remains in a warrior is just enough to produce something like haunting, just enough to make the absence of what was there before noticeable to the warrior's own processes, without being enough to produce anything that could act on that awareness. The warrior does not grieve, but the warrior knows, in some dim and inarticulate register, that there is something to grieve, and then continues walking. Imagine knowing that something important is missing without being able to name it, reach for it, or stop knowing it. Imagine that as your permanent condition, as sustained across centuries and millennia of continuous function, because you cannot malfunction in the way that would end it. The Necron warrior walks on. It fires its Gauss weapons. It follows its orders. And in the spaces between commands, there is whatever that dim haunting looks like from the inside, which the lore does not describe in detail, because some things are worse for being left to imagination. Sarek knows all of this. He carries the knowledge of what he did to every one of them, from the most diminished warrior to the most preserved overlord. He carries it because he chose to preserve his own consciousness fully during biotransference. Being the leader, he received the best body, the most advanced cognitive systems, the most complete transfer. He remembers everything. He feels, in his cold and diminished way, as the weight of that remembrance. And he continues, because there is no alternative to continuing, and because the hope of undoing it, of giving back something to his people, is the only purpose remaining to him that feels proportionate to what was taken. The endgame. What does victory look like for the Necrons? This is a question that the 41st Millennium cannot yet answer, because the Necron awakening is not complete, and the plan the Silent King is executing is still unfolding. But the lore gives us enough to reason toward what the various factions within Necron civilization would accept as a satisfying outcome. For Imhotep, the Stormlord, victory looks like Necron dominion, a galaxy ruled by Necrons. The lesser races cleared from worlds of importance, or kept as functionally useful populations in service of the dynasty's needs. And with himself as the supreme military authority and arguably the supreme political authority if the Silent King can be persuaded or compelled to step aside. Imhotep is not interested in reversing the biotransference. He considers the metal forms the Necrons inhabit to be improvements over their organic predecessors, stronger, more durable, more capable, freed from the biological vulnerabilities that made the Necrontyre so easy to hurt. He does not want to be flesh again. He wants to be powerful forever, and he is. For the dynasties pursuing biotransference reversal, the Nefrech, the supporters of Sarek's long game, victory looks like something quite different. The restoration of organic life to those Necrons who want it. The genuine immortality of consciousness in a body that can feel warmth. Yes, that can age and eat and sleep and dream in the biological sense. That has access to the full range of experience that the Necrontyre lost in the furnaces. This is the goal that the Silent King has been carrying for 65 million says, and it is the goal that requires the preservation of organic life in the galaxy, rather than its conquest. These two visions of victory are not compatible. The Necron civil conflict that is already visible in the tension between Imhotep and Zarek, in the disagreements between the territorial dynasties and the philosophically oriented ones, reflects a fundamental question that the civilization has not yet had to confront fully because it has been too busy waking up and figuring out what the galaxy looks like now. Eventually, when enough of the dynasties are awake and oriented, that question will have to be answered, and the answer the Necrons give to it will determine what the 41st Millennium becomes. The architecture of a tomb world. Inside the sleep, one thing that does not get discussed enough when people talk about the Necron awakening is the sheer physical scale and sophistication of what the Necrons built to house themselves during the Great Sleep. A tomb world is not simply a planet with some underground bunkers. It is one of the most extraordinary engineering achievements in the history of the galaxy, and understanding its architecture helps explain both why the awakening is so terrifying and why so many tomb worlds failed to survive intact. Every tomb world was designed according to a complex template, as developed by Necron architects and engineers at the height of their civilization's technical achievement, and each one was adapted to the specific geology and circumstances of the world in question. The general principle was the same across all of them: vast subterranean warehouses and chambers, honeycombed through the planetary crust at depths where they would be protected from surface bombardment and geological instability. Their spaces dimensionally compressed, using principles of mathematics that modern Imperial physicists cannot yet replicate, to contain far more volume than their apparent external dimensions would suggest. The stasis crypts, the individual units in which each Necron slept, were themselves marvels. A stasis crypt needed to maintain its occupant across 60 million years without any meaningful deterioration in the stored consciousness or the physical integrity of the body. The temporal stabilizers built into each crypt essentially created a small pocket of slowed time around the occupant, reducing the rate at which entropy could act on the sleeper to near zero. The power systems supplying these fields were engineered to function for timescales that the Necrontia themselves had difficulty fully conceptualizing. Redundant backups for the primary systems, arranged in architectures designed to gracefully degrade rather than fail catastrophically, so that when things did go wrong, they went wrong slowly enough that the Canoptech systems could respond. The scale of a major tomb world's underground complex is genuinely staggering. The chambers extend for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The corridors between the stasis halls are wide enough to drive a significant vehicle through, broad enough to allow the Canoptech spiders their full freedom of movement, tall enough that the largest constructs can move without restriction. The tomb mind, the central intelligence managing all of this, is not housed in any single location, but distributed throughout the structure itself, its consciousness running on the quantum substrate of the tomb's very material, which means that destroying the tomb mind requires, in a meaningful sense, destroying the entire complex. The aesthetic choices made in these constructions are worth mentioning because they are, in a word, haunting. What the Necrontyre built their tombs to look like what they were, the final resting places of gods. The columns are carved in abstract forms that suggest the vast civilizational achievements of the Necrontyre, without depicting anything that would be legible to a human observer. The lighting, the cold green glow of Necron power sources, the bioluminescent echoes of quantum energy fields maintaining stasis, creates an environment of preserved grandeur that has been slowly eroding for 60 million years. And this combination of intended magnificence and the damage of impossible age gives every tomb world a character that visitors consistently describe as profoundly unsettling. You are walking through the ruins of something that was not supposed to be ruined. You are looking at the decay of a place designed to last forever. And the things that live here, who built it and who have watched it slowly deteriorate across the vast span of their vigil, do not have the emotional apparatus to mourn what has been lost. They simply repair what can be repaired and catalogue what cannot, and continue. A final thought on the nature of the threat. People who study military doctrine sometimes make a distinction between enemies who are frightening because of what they can do and enemies who are frightening because of what they represent. The first category is the kind that breaks walls and kills soldiers and can be addressed, eventually, by finding walls they cannot break and soldiers they cannot kill. The second category is the kind that, if you understand them fully, changes the questions you ask about the conflict you are in. If the Necrons are firmly in the second category, they are also in the first category. They are terrifyingly capable, militarily dominant, backed by technology no other civilization can match, and possessed of an effectively inexhaustible patience. But even if all of that was somehow neutralized, even if some miracle of the 41st millennium produced a weapon or a strategy that could stop Necron legions in the field and prevent them from rebuilding and returning, the second category of threat would remain. Because the Necrons are not just dangerous enemies, they are a mirror. They are what happens when a civilization chooses power over meaning, immortality over life, the preservation of function over the preservation of soul. But they are the extreme case, shaped by cosmic forces and terrible betrayal into something that no other civilization has quite replicated. But they are a recognizable extreme. The Adeptus Mechanicus reveres the machine over the flesh. The Necrons are what that devotion looks like when it goes all the way. The Imperium preserves the bodies of its dead heroes in dreadnought sarcophagi, those honored warriors kept alive beyond their time in service to the chapter. The Necrons are what an entire civilization of that looks like, maintained across epochs, showing you exactly where the trajectory leads. And under every world where humanity has built its life, the Necrons are waking up, not as a metaphor, not as a cautionary tale, as a literal physical reality, the things that were here before us, just that were old when the first human ancestor looked up at the night sky and wondered what was out there, are stirring beneath the foundations of everything we have built, and they remember that it was theirs first. The Necrons are waking up. The galaxy has not yet understood what that means. And somewhere in the intergalactic dark, 65 million years of grief compressed into something that no longer has the biology to cry. The last of the Silent Kings sails home. Cryptex, the scholar engineers of the Undying, no account of the Necrons is fully complete without spending proper time on the Cryptex, because they are, in many ways, the key to understanding how the Necron civilization actually functions and maintains the kind of technological supremacy it commands over every other faction in the galaxy. A cryptech is what happens when extreme technical brilliance is preserved across the biotransference and the great sleep in a body designed to house it. During biotransference, the quality of necrodermis body provided to a given necrontire was directly proportional to their social status. The finest bodies with the most advanced cognitive systems went to the pharaons and overlords and their courts. The cryptex, the scientists and engineers of Necrontier civilization, ranked high enough to receive bodies capable of preserving not just their personality, but their highly specific technical knowledge and their capacity for genuine intellectual innovation. Ask what a cryptech can do. In the narrative terms the lore uses to describe them, rather than game mechanics, is work on the fabric of reality at scales so small that the results look like magic to anyone without the theoretical framework to understand them. Subatomic manipulation, temporal looping, creating localized regions of space-time that cycle through a specific moment repeatedly, effectively preserving whatever exists within them. Dimensional engineering, the creation of phase gates that allow physical objects to step through the warp at controlled points without exposure to its dangers. Singularity manipulation. The cryptex are not merely engineers in the sense of people who build things. They are physicists operating at levels of theoretical understanding that make the Adeptus Mechanicus look like people who know how to swing a hammer and have deduced the existence of iron ore. Different categories of cryptex specialize in different areas. The technomancer is the most commonly encountered variety, the engineering and maintenance specialist whose understanding of Necron technology's physical principles allows them to modify, repair, and occasionally create new mechanisms from first principles. The chronomancer works with time, bending it at local scales for tactical purposes in ways that create what opponents experience as impossible behavior from Necron forces. The plasmancer weaponizes the plasma physics underlying stellar processes, working with energies at the edge of what contains them. The psychomancer, as it alone among Necrons, engages with the psychological dimension of warfare, creating terror and confusion in organic opponents through technically produced effects that register to their nervous systems as genuine psychic assault. Using the gloom prism technology that makes Necron forces so resistant to actual psychic attacks, turned outward as an offensive tool. The cryptechs are not merely adjuncts to the military force of the Necrons. They are the reason the military force is as formidable as it is, and they are the reason the Necrons might, eventually, find a solution to the biotransference problem. If anyone in the galaxy has the technical capacity to reverse the process that converted the Necrontire into Necrons, it is a cryptech who has spent 60 million years in stasis, preserving the specific knowledge of how that process worked. And the question is whether the will exists to do so at the scale required, and whether any cryptech still alive has a full enough understanding of what was done in the biofoundries to undo it. Closing reflections, what we take away. We have now walked the full length of this story, from the radiation-blasted homeworld of the Necrontire to the present moment when their metal descendants crawl from the dark of their tombs into a galaxy they remember owning, 65 million years removed from the last time they saw it. We have touched on every major element of the narrative, the origin and the tragedy, the war and the sleep, the awakening and its failures, the personalities and the madness, the politics and the philosophy, the technology and the grief. What I want to leave you with, as we wind down, West is a sense of why this specific story matters in the way it does, why the Necrons are not just another enemy faction for Space Marines to fight, not just another army for hobbyists to collect and paint and deploy, but a genuinely important piece of science fiction that does something real. The Necrons are what a civilization looks like after the worst thing that could possibly happen to it, not its military defeat, not its territorial destruction. The worst thing, the loss of what made it itself, the removal of soul, of warmth, of the texture of being alive in a specific way, a specific people in a specific time and place. And they persist, they endure, they wake up and they remember enough to know something is missing, even when they do not have enough left to name it, and they keep going. There is something in that, in the sheer persistence of a civilization that has been robbed of its humanity and continues anyway, that rebuilds what it can rebuild, that fights for territory and purpose, and the vague dream of someday returning to what it was, that resonates in ways that extend beyond the fiction. Cultures survive things they were not supposed to survive. People carry losses they were not designed to carry. The grief of irreversible choice is one of the most human experiences there is, and here it is written across 65 million years of metal and silence, and the grinding echo of everything that was consumed. The Necrons are waking up, and the galaxy, slowly, is beginning to understand what that means.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.